Good evening. Welcome to the RCS Exchange Talks. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name's Dr. Laura Bissell, and I'm the interim head of the Contemporary Performance Practice Programme, and I'm also a lecturer in research at the RCS. So I'm delighted to welcome you to the final exchange talk of 2020 by Rachel O'Neill and Dr. Harry Wilson. Rachel O'Neill is a visual artist, a sonographer, and a visual dramaturg for contemporary performance. Her main interests are materiality, performance aesthetics, expanded sonography, site-specific practice and interdisciplinary practice, social practice, and virtual reality in performance. Rachel is a long-term collaborator with Glass Performance and has worked with other companies and solo artists such as the National Theatre of Scotland, the Women's Creative Company, Superfan, Nick Green, Peter McMaster, Michael John McCarthy, Martin O'Connor, and Dr. Harry Wilson. So Rachel is also lecturer in performance aesthetics at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland on the Contemporary Performance Practice Programme. Harry Wilson is an artist and academic based in Dundee, Scotland. Harry's practice sits between live art, contemporary performance, and new media, and often involves methods of devising through creative response. In his work, Harry is interested in exploring the politics of affect and emotion, autobiography, memory, time, and the body. Harry has shown work at a number of venues and festivals across the UK, including the Arches, the Citizens Theatre, Forest Fringe, DCA Dundee, EAC London, and internationally at Defibrillator Gallery Chicago and Kilowatt Festival San Sepolcro. So some housekeeping for this evening. Tonight's BSL interpreter is Yvonne Strain. Her video will be visible on the right-hand side of the screen, and you can scale that screen up by hovering over the video and using the arrow. If you require closed captioning, the link is in the chat at the side. So tonight's talk will be followed by a Q&A session that will last approximately 15 minutes. If you would like to ask a question, please do write it in the Q&A box, and you can find that at the bottom of your screen. You can upvote questions that you find particularly interesting, and I will do my very best to get to them. For the duration of this webinar, participants' cameras and microphones will be turned off. And if you would like to tweet about this event this evening, please do so at RCS_the exchange, and that's in the chat right now. So a full list of next term's exchange talks can be found in the link that's going to be put in the chat. Fabulous. So I am absolutely delighted to welcome Rachel and Harry to share their work with us this evening. Their exchange talk is titled Between Material, Virtual and Imaginal, Layering Spaces in VR Performance. Thank you so much.
Can't hear you, Rachel.
There we go. First technical error fixed. And we start again. Hello, my name is Rachel O'Neill.
And my name is Harry Wilson. And today we'd like to present our exchange talk titled Between Material, Virtual and Imaginal, Layering Spaces in VR Performance. So in August and September of 2019, we explored the use of virtual reality technologies in intimate performance through a practical R&D project at the National Theatre of Scotland. Working with computing scientist Julie Williamson from the University of Glasgow and digital artists Dennis Reinmuller and Debbie Moody, we used John Berger's 1984 book, And Our Faces, My Heart, Brief as Photos, as a starting point to develop a virtual reality performance installation that aimed to translate some of the textures and ideas from Berger's book into an intimate experience for 8 audience members at a time.
This talk will reflect on the findings from this process at the meeting point between VR and performance. The talk will focus on the ways that the work played with the layering of physical and virtual space, as well as how the piece utilised the material and the virtual to amplify what Laura Marks terms the luminous images of our imagination. Our backgrounds are both in contemporary performance.
I have a practice-based PhD from theatre studies at the University of Glasgow and have been interested for a while now in making intimate performance work in response to theories of image and, more recently, digital media.
And I'm a visual artist, scenographer, and collaborator within the field of contemporary performance. I'm interested in how scenographics can create an atmosphere that people can be part of.
So as a way to introduce the feel of the performance, we're going to narrate the experience of the work from the perspective of one of the audience members. And this is obviously a partial account of what you may have experienced participating in the piece, but we hope that it goes some way towards introducing and distilling what the work felt like, its spaces and textures. And we would invite you to close your eyes if you want to, and try to picture the spaces and events being described in your imagination.
You're sitting on a chair in a white rehearsal room at the National Theatre of Scotland's Rock Villa building in Glasgow. You're sitting in a line with 7 other audience members. You're holding a small black marble in your hand. You're sat facing 2 cubes, maybe 12 feet wide, a black one on the left and a white one on the right. The black one looks like it's made from a thick black theatre drape. It has a fuzzy texture. The white cube is made from a lighter fabric. A voice starts to speak. It's coming from a speaker that's placed underneath your seat.
Hello. How to start. My name's Harry and I'm recording this on the 9th of September 2019. I'm sitting in the kitchen of my flat in the south side of Glasgow, and it's just coming up to 4:30 in the afternoon. I'm looking out of the kitchen window, which faces onto our back garden. I'm looking at a tree in my back garden. It's a rowan tree.
The speaker of the text takes their time and is softly spoken. They go on to talk about their perception of the sunlight in their garden, personal connections to the name Rowan, and the mythology of trees. They talk about addressing you from 10 days in the past, when they recorded the audio, and that even though you are separated by space and time, you can still share this moment. The 4 of you with black marbles are ushered into the black cube by a performer. The other 4 audience members go to the white cube. Inside, there's a chair at each corner of the black-sized room construction with a VR headset placed on it. A celestial-style drone sound plays from a speaker in the middle of the space. You're invited to place the headset on. You can see a 3D simulation of the physical black space you entered a moment ago. Although there are no chairs or other people. And instead of the rehearsal room ceiling, you can see the night sky.
After a moment, a woman's voice starts to speak on your headset. She sounds young. It feels like she is whispering into your ear. She starts, "We are both storytellers. Lying on our backs, we look up at the night sky." She talks about how people who named the constellations were storytellers too, and that tracing imaginary lines between stars gave these people an identity. The 4 walls of the virtual room fade away, leaving the grey floor and an expanse of stars. Other voices start simultaneously. They appear to be placed in the 3 corners of the virtual room you are sitting in. As you move your head towards each corner of the room, you can fade the speakers up and down to tune in to the different voices. There are a range of accents and genders signified by the voices. Some talk of the movement of people and the concept of home. Others recite poems about the age of mountains or talk about being separated from a lover. Some of the text is addressed directly to you as if you are the lover. You look up at the virtual night sky and discover that you can make the names and lines of the constellations appear by looking at them. When you do this, the voices blend into a general texture, and you can only pick out individual words rather than any specific stories. All of the voices finish except one.
Immigration does not only involve leaving behind, crossing water, living amongst strangers, but also undoing the very meaning of the world. To emigrate is always to dismantle the centre of the world, and so to move into a lost, disorientated one of fragments. The virtual walls return, and the voice from the speaker at the start returns. They ask you to close your eyes, to pay attention to this liminal space between worlds. They count from 3 to 1, and then ask you to remove your headset. After a moment, the performer tells you that you can open your eyes. You take a moment to adjust to the different quality of light in the room. The space feels different. For those of you who had your eyes closed during this description, you can now open your eyes.
We'd like to begin by telling you a bit about the book And Our Faces, My Heart, Brief as Photos. In our individual practices, we had connected to Berger's writing, and over a few years had spoken about his work and the possibility of collaborating on something. At the outset of this process, exploring VR and intimate performance at NTS, it seemed like Berger's writing may offer a useful starting point for making something together, as it's so often concerned with relationships between technology and perception, but also imbued with a sense of autobiography, love, and intimacy. Berger's book, And Our Faces, in particular, offers a personal and poetic exploration of his ideas, where anecdotal reflections on time and space are interspersed with observations on storytelling, art, love, and absence. The book is structured as a series of vignettes or snapshots, punctuated by Berger's poetry and intimate confessions addressed to the reader as if they are Berger's lover. As a result, the book exists somewhere between theoretical text, fiction, and memoir.
Taking into account the non-linear structure of And Our Faces and embodying Berger's ability to reflect in a non-linear way on time and space, this talk aims to present Harry and I's working process as a collection of vignettes. These vignettes aim to capture and highlight key parts of the making process, as well as simultaneously highlight some reflections that have emerged since the piece was made and take into account the new context that the performance currently sits in, one in which it is not possible to physically gather in the same space as your audience. One of the defining characteristics of the word vignette in the context of art or photography is that the edges of the subject are softening or shaded away. And we are embracing this idea of the diffused edges of each of our vignettes. They're a series of thoughts captured in moments of reflection which blur at the edges. The structure of Berger's And Our Faces also places these vignettes in juxtaposition so that the audience can make their own leaps of imagination and moments of connection between sections of writing that spans time and space. Our intention with this talk was to follow the same guiding structure.
Vignette 1, A New Way of Seeing. In his 1972 book, Ways of Seeing, Berger writes that the relation between what we see and what we know is never settled. Our knowledge and beliefs about the world affect how we see things, and of course, images, representations, art can affect what we come to know and believe about the world. In Ways of Seeing, Berger predominantly discusses painting and photography. Through this project, we were interested in exploring how to update Berger's ideas on the relationships between seeing and knowing, imagination and reality, in the context of newer technologies of representation, such as various digital and new media, virtual reality, smartphones, digital images, deep fakes, AI art, etc. How do 21st century technologies of representation shape the ways that we perceive and know the world? How do theories of image intersect with discussions around digital culture, virtuality, and immersive media? What are our 21st century ways of seeing?
Berger also discusses the kind of seeing that comes before words, writing, "The child looks and recognizes before it speaks." We were interested in creating a work that foregrounded these modes of attention, the kind of looking and experiencing that comes before naming, a way of experiencing images that becomes more like a dream, where the relationships between what we see and what we know are even less settled. In the essay, Steps Towards a Small Theory of the Visible, Berger describes a dream where he discovered a secret to get inside whatever he was looking at, and once inside, to rearrange its appearances so that they became more evidently unique. We are wondering whether this ability to get inside images, enabled by imaginative dreamlike states, echoes the way that we experience images in virtual reality. VR is about getting inside images, rearranging appearances, reordering laws of time and space to dismantle the center of the world.
Vignette 2, Time and Consciousness. This is an extract from And Our Faces, My Heart Briefest Photos. We are unique insofar as we constitute two events: the event of our biological organism, and in this, we are like the tortoise and the hare, and the event of our consciousness. Thus, in us, two times coexist, corresponding with these two events. The time during which we are conceived, grow, mature, age, die, and the time of our consciousness. In reality, we are always between two times, that of the body and that of consciousness. Hence the distinction made in all other cultures between body and soul. The soul is first and above all the locus of another time.
Vignette 3, The Space Feels Different. The book And Our Faces is split into two parts. Part 1 is about time, and part 2 is about space. For this work, we wanted these two components of time and space to be visible. We thought about time as abstract and space as concrete, about time as felt and space as perceived, about time as memory and space as geography, about time as virtual and space as actual. But the more we thought about these distinctions, the more they folded into each other too. Scenographically, however, we wanted the performance space to draw attention to time and space and their relationships to the material and the immaterial. Micah Bleeker defines the role of the audience as seer, who combines what they think they see with subjective experience to augment and extend scenography. These ideas of expanded scenography guided our thinking in the curation of space as intrinsic to the experience of performance. This, combined with the additional layers of the virtual spaces within the physical spaces, enabled a way to extend the physical space and connect to what Laura Marks argues for in Restoring, a flow between haptic and optical that our culture is currently lacking. The performance space was divided into two areas by theatre flats. On one side, the performance space, and on the other, the waiting area. Within the performance space, there were two constructed spaces, one white and one black, positioned in front of a row of chairs. We referred to this seating area as the liminal space. Within the black space and the white space were the headsets, which depicted the virtual environments. The idea of the threshold was an important part of the making process as we considered the audience transition between one actual space and another actual space, between the actual and the virtual, and from the virtual to the actual. Sometimes in VR contexts, this is called onboarding and offboarding. We wanted to draw attention to the audience's experience within the actual world as a way to emphasize the layering of actual and virtual space, and to highlight the ways that the combination of these two spaces was simultaneously active within the performance.
We noticed from our experience as makers and watchers of performance that this kind of movement between spaces, between modes of attention, rules of engagement, is something that intimate performance practices can do very well. Intimate performances such as those of Adrian Howells, Rosanna Cade, Sylvia Mercuriali and others invite us to consider how our attention is being curated, how our hand is being held by the work. Much of the text was developed in this style, carefully composed instructions and poetic reflections, gently guiding the audience through their experience, encouraging them to linger in these liminal spaces between actual and virtual worlds, between wakefulness and a dream, between imagination and reality. Within the physical room-like constructions, the audience were guided to place their headsets on. The virtual space replicated the exact dimensions, colors, and materials of the physical space. Virtual space was layered on top of material space. The decision to replicate the physical scenographics in the virtual environment allowed the experience in the headsets to sit somewhere between material and immaterial realities. As the walls fall away and the scene becomes more interactive, the virtual simulation becomes a kind of extension of our material realities. In the sensory spaces of these white and black virtual environments, material space is first simulated, then extended through impressionistic digital animations and augmented by layered audio and user interaction. Similarly to the physical spaces, the intention for the virtual spaces was to enable time and space to become visible, to become a felt experience, an atmosphere. Once the walls had fallen away, the limits of the audience's visible world extended infinitely, as far as the distant horizon of a 3D simulated skybox. This mimics Gernot Böhmer's definition of atmosphere as spatially unbounded, poured out, and placeless. We wanted these moments to be a space where two events in time could coexist, as outlined in Berger's text. The event of a person's biological organism and the event of a person's consciousness. To simultaneously draw attention to each individual audience member's physical body, as well as a more abstract idea of consciousness, soul.
Vignette 4. Faces appear before me. This is an extract from Our Faces, My Heart, Brief as Photos. Often when I shut my eyes, faces appear before me. What is remarkable about them is their definition. Each face has the sharpness of an engraving. None of the faces is ever familiar to me. Usually they're fairly still, but they're not static images. They are alive. They're like the face of a person thinking. They're clearly not aware of my watching them, yet I am able to make them look at me. Make them is perhaps too strong a term. It requires no great effort on my part. Instead of simply watching a group of them, I have to concentrate my attention on a particular one, and then she or he, as it frequently happens in daily life, looks up and returns my gaze. Their optical distance away from me is normally about 3 or 4 meters. But when one returns my gaze, her or his expression is such, its intensity is such, that our faces might only be a few centimeters apart. The expression, although modified by the face's character and age, is always similar. Its intensity is not a question of emotion or of pleasure or pain. The face looks straight at me, and without words, by the expression of the eyes alone, it affirms the reality of its existence. As if my gaze had called out a name, and the face, by returning it, was answering present. I am always aware that if I open my eyes, the faces will disappear, become absent. What is less clear to me is what happens when I shut my eyes. Is it I who cross the barrier that normally excludes them, or is it they who cross it? They belong to the past. The certainty with which I know this has nothing to do with their clothes or the style of their faces. They belong to the past because they're dead. And I know this by the way that they look at me. They look at me with something approaching recognition.
Vignette 5, Haptic Visuality, to experience touch in a virtual space. Our aim was to create a performance space that enabled a sense of touch, an experiential moment that asked the audience to be present in their bodies and for their bodies to be part of the process of seeing. A space that enabled the audience to connect to different sense modalities. We aim to create a layering of touch, first through physical material and the literally haptic elements like holding a marble or a rowan berry, and then through the layering of the virtual experience. We wanted to use this layering to draw attention to the haptic qualities of sight. Throughout Berger's work, there's an acute sensory awareness and attention drawn to the material actual world. In And Our Faces, Berger describes in detail the material presence of visible things, including the reflection of a lilac lit by the sun, the glow of a glowworm in relation to a distant star, and a white kitten that appears and disappears.
We have been interested in Laura Marx's influential theory of haptic visuality. Marx's theory places importance on the material qualities of images, where we can draw attention to the details that escape our symbolic recognition. Haptic visuality brings us into closer contact with that which we do not know and for which we would have no categories. The virtual spaces in the white and black rooms were an attempt to allow the audience to encounter a familiar space that transformed into a space with no symbolic categories. Cats walking through walls, fragmented text, infinity spaces, virtual worlds which activate the audience's bodies and their imagination rather than merely represent the physical world. On reflection, we've also become aware that these virtual spaces encourage the audience to appreciate the materiality of VR as a medium. Marx might term this the skin of the film, but perhaps we can repurpose this to describe the skin of the screen, an embodied encounter with virtual space, but also lenses, pixels, VR's apparatus.
Vignette 6. Everything was virtual. Once earth and sky were passionately one, yet nothing had form. Everything was virtual. For the world and its forms and its extension to come into existence, earth and sky had to be torn apart and separated. In reflecting on this work, we've found it useful to draw on broader philosophical definitions of the virtual, not as something in opposition to reality, but as something that is always potentially appearing. In other words, to think of the relationships between the actual and the virtual, rather than the real and the simulated, where the actual refers to something concrete and physical, and the virtual is abstract, but nevertheless real. Both actual and virtual can have very real effects. For Brian Masumi, the virtual is always potentially appearing, but never actually present as such. Masumi therefore talks of the virtual as an aspect of every act of perception, and that virtual things make themselves felt. They make a forceful difference. They are effectively real. We found this concept of the virtual as pure potential and as something with real effects useful to keep in mind when considering the potential effects and bodily perceptions involved in virtual reality. In our performance, this space in between the actual and the virtual was explored initially in my framing text. This text, written as a kind of extended onboarding, played with the effects of the imaginary images produced by spoken words. At the start of the text, I described the view from my kitchen window and the particular light that hits the rowan tree in my back garden. The text aimed to conjure an image of the view from my kitchen window in the mind of the audience. To use Masumi's term, the rowan tree appears in effect in the perceptions of the audience. This moment emphasized the role of the imagination in the creation of virtual images and the way that much narrative description already takes place in a kind of liminal space between the actual and the virtual. In a Q&A after the sharing, audience members commented on the vivid nature of these descriptions and that they highlighted the virtuality of everyday perceptual experience. By exploring the space between the actual and the virtual, the work prompted one spectator to consider how representations of space change the way we see.
Vignette 7, Lilacs. This is an extract from And Our Faces, My Heart, Brief as Photos. The scent of lilac, you once said, is not so far from the smell of cows in the stable. Both are smells of peace and procrastination. The days are becoming long, and in the evening I sit in the kitchen reading without a light. On the windowsill is a jug with a flowering branch of lilac, which I cut in a friend's garden. It is pale purple, the colour of a much washed ultramarine blue shirt. When I was young, I had a shirt that colour, and the great Indonesian painter Affandi painted a portrait of me in it. Both portrait and the shirt have disappeared. Through the open window, I can hear a cuckoo and the chainsaws of the woodcutters still working. When I glanced up a moment ago, the branch of lilac in the fading light looked like a distant hill of blossoming trees merging into the dusk. It was disappearing. The walls of the house are thick, for the winters are cold. On the window embrasure, close to the window panes, hangs a shaving mirror. As I look up now, I see reflected in the mirror a sprig of the lilac branch. Each petal of each tiny flower is vivid, distinct, near, so near that the petals look like the pores of a skin. At first, I do not understand why what I see in the mirror is so much more intense than the rest of the branch, which in fact is nearer to me. Then I realise that what I'm looking at in the mirror is the far side of the lilac, the side fully lit by the last light of sun. Every evening, my love for you is placed like that mirror.
Vignette 8, Between Waking and Sleeping. In the book, Berger invites the reader to imagine our reality in that state between waking and sleeping. You can go away in a dream, or you can open your eyes, be aware of your body, the room. What distinguishes this state from full wakefulness is that there is no distance between word and meaning. It is the place of original naming. We've been thinking about this state, and that maybe this is another kind of space that we were interested in exploring in our piece. By actively inviting the audience to imagine the space that my voice was recorded in, by exploring a kind of reflective, meditative atmosphere to the performance, and using the virtual environments as an extension of our everyday perception, we hope to explore this space where perception is felt as much as thought. We also wonder if this space is something similar to the immersive experience of reading a book like Berger's. When reading, you can be immersed in the images, the thoughts, and the affects of the book, but still be aware of your physical reality, the space in which you're reading. In making this work, we were interested in an experience that might feel a little like being immersed in the images and textures of the book, and that VR might offer an interesting tool with which to do this. This was perhaps most apparent in the white virtual space. Initially placed in a white room that replicates the physical construction the audience entered into, they are then confronted by a series of images and one text extracted from the book. A white cat appears and disappears through the white walls. There is a tree swaying in the breeze. As the wall falls away, we are left with the tree in the near distance and an expanse of white space. The final text plays from Berger's book, a kind of lover's missive about being buried together, addressed to the listener, reader. Computer art historian Nick Lambert has argued that there are similarities between mental images formed in the imagination and the digital simulations of 3D computer-generated images. Lambert writes, that the computer facilitates the extension of our visual imagination. And he says that the process of visualizing a scene in the mind's eye is a kind of mental simulation that echoes the way computer simulations make images from immaterial objects. Lambert draws on the imaginal realm of Islamic philosophy. Much like computer images, the imaginal realm is a world created by the visual imagination that has an independent existence between the physical and spiritual planes. In other words, the imaginal realm mediates between abstract thought and the material world. More recently, Laura Marks has drawn on Islamic philosopher Mullah Sadra's ideas of the imaginal realm to argue for cinema in images as inspiration from without. Marx argues that representational arts can come from the imaginal realm, make the imperceptible perceptible, and mediate between material world and intellect. Marx describes the imaginal realm as both intangible and more real than matter, and as a supra-sensory reality. These descriptions can be easily applied to the unique sense perceptions of VR images. They are intangible, but can have very real effects. And they exist outside of the boundaries of traditional sensory realities. Drawing on these readings of the imaginal realm, we can think of the ways our performance acted as a mediator between the embodied perceptions of the audience and their cognitive understanding of the experience, between material world and intellect, between body and mind, or between Berger's word and meaning. In this context, VR can turn our attention to what Marx terms the luminous images hidden in the senses. It can help us to practically explore new ways of seeing, feeling, and being in the world.
Vignette 9. How do you create an intimate performance when we can't touch? Of course, this work was developed in a pre-pandemic world where the idea of gathering in close proximity to performers and other audience members was not at all controversial. We are now all living through a very different reality where this performance would not have been able to take place in the form that it was in. However, the intimate encounters in the piece were mostly mediated by various technologies: the recorded voices, headsets, digital images. On reflection, this piece could quite easily suit a model of socially distanced live experience. We have also been in discussion with Julie and Dennis and Debbie about what a version of this might look like that could take place entirely in a virtual environment and be experienced by audience members at home through their desktop, smartphones, or if they have them, VR headsets. We're in the process of exploring Mozilla Hubs as a platform to host such a work, and would like to develop some more ideas explicitly in this online environment that could be experienced by audience members at home. We have tried to imagine the performance of and our faces in a post-pandemic world.
Imagine a performance for one audience member that you experience on your desktop or your phone. You enter a 3D simulation of a room through your browser that becomes an immersive encounter with the ideas and images of Berger's text.
Or imagine a performance for one audience member at a time where they enter a constructed room 3 meters by 3 meters, and are immersed in a 3D projection. They stand in the middle of the room as the walls fall away into an expansive infinity space. Imagine these performance rooms for one person could tour the country and be positioned in site-responsive outdoor locations.
Or imagine an audio version of the work that you experience on your daily walk. This version invites you to reflect on what you see and consider it as a kind of performance, to examine the rules of space and the relationship between physical and imaginary spaces.
Or imagine a VR performance an audience member can access when they're in the state between being awake and being asleep.
Imagine being able to get inside an image and rearranging it from the inside. Vignette 10, the visible and invisible. The next animal was a kitten, an entirely white kitten. It belonged to a kitchen with an uneven floor, an open chimney, a wooden table, and rough, whitewashed walls. Against the walls, the kitten was almost invisible except for its dark eyes. When it turned its head away, it disappeared into the wall. When it jumped about over the floor or onto the table, it was like a creature that had escaped from the walls. The way it appeared and disappeared gave it the mysterious intimacy of a household god. I have always thought that household gods were animals, sometimes visible and sometimes invisible, but always present. As I sat at the table, the cat jumped onto my legs. It had sharp white teeth as white as its fur and a pink tongue. Like all kittens, it played continually with its own tail, on the backs of chairs, with scraps on the floor. When it wanted to rest, it looked for something soft to lie on, and watching it, fascinated throughout a week, I observed that whenever it could, it chose something white, a towel, a white pullover, some washing. Then with eyes shut and mouth closed, curled up, it became invisible, surrounded by the white walls. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Rachel and Harry. Thank you. That was fabulous. So great to hear about your work. I want to just remind our audience, if you've got any questions for Rachel and Harry, you can pop them in the Q&A, but maybe I can kick off with a little question. I found that so fantastic. And I maybe wondered, I've got two questions. One's probably very practical and one a little bit more of an imagining. Sometimes perceptions of virtual reality is that it is going to be a simulation or a way of trying to recreate the real. And I thought it was really fascinating how you were talking about, rather than the real and the simulated, the kind of actual. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more about, rather than trying to recreate or simulate a reality, what this space in between can offer in terms of the audience experience.
Shall I go, Rach?
Yeah, you go. You go. I'm forming my response, but on you go, Harry.
Well, yeah. I mean, the starting point really was to just replicate, or well, the design for the physical spaces developed alongside the design for the virtual spaces. So, but really, they were kind of a black room and a white room. And that had kind of come out of discussions we'd had around the book and how to realize our impressions of the book or something, or the two parts of the book. But then I guess what we've realized on reflection, something that Rachel and I have talked about a bit, is that there's a possibility there with VR to make these really kind of fragmented images appear, and they can kind of come out of nowhere, and in a way it gives you more kind of freedom as to what you can put in there, I guess. So I mean, I don't know if this is directly addressing what you're asking, Laura, but just that there's something about the virtual space that suits a more kind of impressionistic response, maybe, and that felt quite liberating. And I think we only realized that after we made the thing as well. But Rach, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Well, maybe what I wanted to add in was a key part of the development process for us, Harry, you can correct me if I'm wrong, was when we were working with this idea of how do you create a physical space with a virtual space within it. And as part of our development, we got the headsets, and we were kind of experimenting with different headsets and different VR modes. Anyway, whilst we were playing around with the headsets, we put on the headset when it was in its working position. So when you put on a headset and there's no virtual reality program in it, that you enter this kind of expansive space. Anyway, Harry and I had big discussions about how exciting this kind of expansive space was, because all of a sudden things became possible. And round about that time, we were thinking a lot about, the text with Berger, which is reoccurring through the book, of the space between awake and asleep, or awakeness and consciousness, and all of those ideas. So we knew that we kind of wanted to kind of to situate the performance in this kind of in-between space. Anyway, I hope that kind of answers some of your question of what it was that we were aiming for.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, we've got a couple of questions in that will maybe help unpack some of those things. We've not got a huge amount of time left, but I'll read you this question from Florence. I was wondering if you could expand on the idea of intimacy of spaces. What makes a space intimate, the feeling of it? How do we construct intimacy in performance spaces that don't really invite it? Great question, Florence.
That's a great question, Florence.
That is great.
Thank you.
I mean, the thing that springs to mind initially is that is the use of recorded voice that we had. So actually, we made a decision not to have the first text on headphones. Partly that was a pragmatic one, because of putting on headphones, taking them off, then putting on a headset, and then it felt like too much in a way. But then when you go into the rooms, the voiceovers are recorded. And they're placed spatially, so that if you turn your head, they stay, and your head moves, kind of thing. If that makes sense. But certainly, the space we were working in was like a rehearsal room, so it didn't really have that sense of intimacy. But I think we definitely were playing with the use of text to create that, and the use of recorded text to create that in particular.
Also the idea of, first of all, thank you, Florence, great question. But this idea of touch, so I think one of the things that we were talking about quite early on in the process was, how do you create an intimate performance using virtual reality, and how do you do that in a space so that you can create this sense of a felt experience, or feelings of touch. So I think that's why we were quite set on the idea of working between the physical space and the virtual space, because within the physical space, we were trying to put the ideas in the physical space of touch, like putting things in. So when the audience members arrived, they were given something in their hand. They were asked to look at their hand for a key part of the performance. And so we were really kind of trying to activate the bodies of the people who were taking part in the performance, so that when they enter into the space, there is a kind of more heightened awareness of space, time, touch, materiality, all of these things that were kind of that is so important in Berger's work, that we were trying to draw the audience's attention to.
Thank you so much. We are actually out of time. We've got a few more questions in, so maybe I'll just leave you a question to think about, which is, how do you feel this pandemic world impacts the messiness and blurring of time and space in performance? So we are out of time, but at the end you were inviting some of those other imaginings of how this work might happen now. So I will leave you with Kate's question. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. Thank you in particular to Rachel and Harry for their amazing paper. Thank you also to Yvonne, our BSL interpreter, and Anish, who's been doing the closed captions this evening. So a final thanks to the Research and Knowledge Exchange teams. You can follow them on Twitter at RCS_the exchange, and the next exchange talk will be on the 18th of January, and it will be Dr. Lucy Hollingsworth when we're back after the winter break. So thank you so much again to our audience for tuning in and for your great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. That concludes our exchange talk, so we hope that you will join us for the next one. So thank you again, Rachel and Harry. Bye, everybody.